It was another typical day at Oakwood Elementary. Tommy sat in the back of the classroom, staring at his math worksheet, but he wasn't focused on the numbers. Instead, he was thinking about the way Charlie had shoved him in the hallway this morning, how Sarah had laughed when he tripped, and even how his seatmate, Ben, had refused to share a pencil when Tommy's had snapped. To be honest, school felt like a tough place to be lately. Tommy wasn't a troublemaker, not at all, but somehow he'd become a magnet for teasing and exclusion. The worst part? The more frustrated Tommy got, the easier it was for him to snap back or ignore the people around him. That was until lunch, when Mrs. Jensen, the warm and wise art teacher, sat down next to him in the crowded cafeteria. Noticing his hunched shoulders and the uneaten sandwich on his tray, she smiled gently. Tommy nodded, not trusting himself to say much. "I don't get it," he finally muttered. "Why is everyone so mean?" "Well," Mrs. Jensen said, "sometimes people have bad days. Sometimes they've forgotten one of the most important rules of all." Tommy glanced at her, curious but skeptical. "What rule?" Mrs. Jensen leaned in, her eyes twinkling. "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule." Tommy frowned. He'd heard it before, of course, but it sounded so simple. Too simple, maybe. "You might be surprised," Mrs. Jensen said, as though reading his thoughts. "Kindness is powerful. It spreads. Sometimes you just need to start the ripple." The words stuck with Tommy. That afternoon, he decided to test them. During PE, when Charlie tripped over his shoelaces, falling into the dirt, Tommy rushed over. Instead of laughing, he offered his hand to help him up. Charlie stared at him in surprise, but took the hand. Later, when Sarah was struggling to solve a tricky science problem, Tommy noticed her frustration. "Want me to help?" he asked quietly. She blinked at him, startled, but nodded. By the end of class, she was smiling, and they had solved the problem together. And when Ben forgot his notebook at home the next day, Tommy pulled one of his own spares from his bag. "Here," he said with a shrug. Ben hesitated, looking at him cautiously, but finally mumbled, "Thanks." Things didn't change overnight. There were still moments of teasing, and some classmates were slower to respond than others. But bit by bit, Tommy noticed tiny differences. Charlie started saying hi to him in the hallways instead of ignoring him. Sarah began saving him a spot during lunch. And Ben? He actually offered Tommy his pencil during art class, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. By the end of the week, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in a while. Peace. As he walked home, he smiled, remembering Mrs. Jensen's advice. She was right. All it took was one person to start the ripple. And for Tommy, it wasn't just about being treated better in return. It was about knowing that he'd made a choice to bring kindness into the world, and that in itself felt pretty great.